Well, thanks for inviting me here. As John said, I'm Fran Harty. I'm the Director of Special Projects for the Nature Conservancy. And tonight we're going to talk about the Greater Kankakee Ecosystem. So here's sort of what we're going to take a trip from where the Kankakee ends up near Channahon. Channahon means the meeting of three rivers. And that's the DuPage, Kankakee, and Des Plaines. And they meet to form the Illinois. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to talk a little bit about the Medewan National Tallgrass Prairie, a little bit about the Kankakee Torrent. If you haven't known of that, it's not a science fiction movie. It's actually a pretty cool geological feature. We're going to talk about the ghost of the Everglades ecosystem past, which will be a little short thing. Talk about the Kankakee River, freshwater mussels in the river, some fish in the streams that feed the river. We'll talk about Moments wetlands, also about the Pembroke savannas and some of the flatwoods down there. We're going to talk about a reluctant ecosystem engineer that you guys will be surprised to be introduced to. Talk a little bit about endangered species and end up with some threats to the system and also some good news perhaps on the future of the system. So with that, let's see if we can get this to go the way we want to. All right, the handout, there should be a map. If you don't have it, hopefully you can snag one. There's a whole bunch of them over here. So we're going to start up here. Does that show up on the screen? Okay. The other day I did this in some kind of a smart board and it wouldn't. It reflect off. So I don't know how smart it was. So up here is Channahon, where the Kankakee runs into the Illinois River. And we're going to take it this way. And we're going to talk right here a little bit about Medewan here in a minute. Then we're going to come down this way and we'll end up all the way down here in Indiana where we are now. So the first place we're going to talk about is Medewan Tallgrass Prairie. And Medewan's not actually in the Kankakee Sands area, but it's so big, it's the elephant in the ecosystem, so to speak. You can't hardly go by it without talking about it. It's 19,165 acres right now. That's like 23 square miles. That's a huge piece of property by Illinois standards. Anything east of the Mississippi, that's a pretty good sized piece of property. It was a former Joliet arsenal. It's now under the jurisdiction of the U.S. Forest Service, and it's being restored to tallgrass prairie. So it's the largest tallgrass prairie restoration east of the Mississippi, 19,000 some acres. It's known for its grassland birds. And I'm going to show you just one data slide. I promise you'll never see another one of these. But a good friend of mine, Jim Herkert, is the ornithologist that's been working on the bird communities, grassland bird community there for years. And because it's so large, it has what we call area-sensitive grassland birds. And these are birds that, if you don't have at least 100 acres, they're not going to breed. There's just something about it, psychological, I don't know what it is. They don't either probably, but they need big acreages. You won't find them on 20 acres or 30 or 40, at least in numbers that are going to be successful. So what you have on the left here is a graph shows bobolinks. Bobolinks like tall grass. And the other side is grasshopper sparrow, and they like short grass. So you see, if you had 100 acres, you'd have to decide. You'd be playing God. Do I want grasshopper sparrows or do I want bobolinks? Medewan is so big that they have enormous populations of a whole suite of grassland birds. And when I say a whole suite, it'd be like bobolinks, Henslow sparrows, grasshopper sparrows, meadowlarks, which you're all familiar with, savanna sparrows, stick thistles, and the upland sandpiper, which is endangered, I think, both in Indiana and Illinois. But the interesting thing about Medewan is, and it's hard for a short guy to say, but size does matter in these cases. So for what these slides show is that not only are there pretty stable populations, they're very large. They represent about 300 birds per point every time they do a sample. And that's just on the sample. So there's really thousands of birds on this large habitat. So Medewan's known for its grassland birds, but another huge component that's less known are shrubland birds. And grasslands and shrubland birds together are some of the, showing the steepest declines of populations in the country. So they're both in trouble. The shrubland birds, this is a loggerhead shrike, and it's sort of the, if not the nefarious, notorious poster bird for shrubland birds. It's certainly one of the most dynamic. And it's, there's 8 to 12 nests in Medewan every year with loggerhead shrikes. And does everybody know what loggerhead shrike's famous for? It's also called the butcher bird. Yeah, actually, right. It has these little dinky feet, songbird feet. So it doesn't have talons. It's got these little feet. And it's got that big hooked bill like a raptor. So it catches things like snakes or small mammals or insects. And it uses thorns, or in this case a barbed wire, to hold its prey. And then it kills it. And it also leaves them hanging there. And there's two reasons for that. One is a nice way to cache your food, but also in the spring when they're really busy, that's what attracts the females. So the female's flying around. She sees a fence line full of dead snakes. She's going, this guy's a pretty good provider. That refrigerator's full. So that's one of the things I speculate is why they do that. So it's way after dinner, so here you go. one impaled decayed snake. That's fresh. That was probably done within 15 or 20 minutes when we walked up there. So that's what it looks like when they impale something. That's an Osage orange. This is thorn. Snake's hung right on it. It's actually still contracting. That's why that knot is down there. So that's what it looks like when something's impaled by a loggerhead shrike. And then I mentioned there's a lot of shrubland birds. There's 3 or 4, like the mockingbird, which is far north, as you probably get them very, very in numerous numbers, is at Medewan. Mockingbird, they have catbirds and thrashers. They all make these stick necks like this. They're all full of sticks. Unlike a robin's nest, which is mud and grass, these are sticks. But the shrike's the only one of those 4 that actually lines it. So if you look real close in there, you see all that white, that's deer hair. This is all deer hair. But you see that red casting in there? That's baling twine. And that's baling twine from the fact that a lot of the Joliet arsenal is grazed. You can see this grassing is pretty short. So we'll talk more about that, but we use cows to do some conservation work for us, and they do the grazing high and low depending on what birds we're trying to keep on the property. And then we'll be done here in a minute on birds, but the Chicago Wilderness is a group, a bunch of conservation organizations that got together in Chicago. They call it Chicago Wilderness. It's kind of a nice term for, oxymoron type term. But they did a shrubland blitz a few years ago, and Medewan had 100% of the shrikes of the whole area. So, all the shrikes are at Medewan. They also represented 74% of Bell's vireo. It's another shrubland bird. It's a little bitty bird. 74% of those. And black-billed cuckoos, they had 20%. So it's also an incredibly important place for shrubland birds. Okay. Kankakee Sands. Where did all the sand come from? Well, here's a diagram of the Kankakee Plain after Glacial Lake Chicago burst through the moraine. Shot all this water through, coming this way toward me. So it laid all that sand down flat. And that Kankakee Torrent is actually not one event. Apparently it's happened many, many times over the eons, and it just kept doing it. It kept laying down sand. But once it stopped and everything sort of ameliorated to where it would be, he had all that sand out in that plain. And so the dunes then had to form. And so this is west, southwest. Around here the winds are from the south-southwest. They blow this way. And so if you look at a topo map of the Kankakee Sands there, you'll see all these green things are forested dunes. So you see they kind of look like pillows, and the high end is to the east, so the wind's blowing this way. So when it was flat, the wind started to blow, and here's the kind of a little interactive slide that shows you how that actually works. Watch that go. So see, they start to blow, and they get high at the other end. They start to make a crescent, or a parabolic dune. So that's how that worked. So that's how the Kankakee Sand has its dunes. Okay. This is what I call a ghost in the ecosystem past. You're all familiar with the Grand Kankakee Marsh. You're living in it, pretty much. Here's a very old map. It shows the Kankakee Marsh. This is sort of their schematic of it. Here's the river going along. They only show it on one side. This is a really old map, and I forgot the date, but I have it written down in my notebook if you actually need to see it later. So there's Lake Michigan. They drew in the Grand Kankakee Marsh, and there's essentially, doesn't even, well, here, this is the Iroquois, the Pokemink, and it doesn't show how it comes up and connects. But that's one map. Here's another one. This one I thought was pretty interesting because not only does it show the Kankakee River, but it shows the old Hubbard Trace, which became the Vincennes Highway, which then became Route 1, the first highway in Illinois. And it was funny today, I was driving over, I was going straight east, and it was on some road called the Vincennes Highway, or Vincennes Trail, and I'm thinking, I didn't know it ever went east, but maybe it did. But this goes all the way from Danville. This is the trail the Indians obviously had, and then Gordon Hubbard is the one who essentially kept going up and down it, working the fur trade for the big companies. I forgot his name, Astor. And then ultimately, he became a very important Chicago businessman. He was actually very instrumental in getting Lincoln on the ballot for presidency. So he was a famous guy, did a lot of things in his life, and as you all know, he was married to Watseka, which the town is named after at some time down the road. So this is kind of what it looks like today when you map it out. And all this color here is the sand that's sort of left after the Kankakee Sand. The blue is where it's the outline of the Grand Kankakee Marsh. 1,000,000 acres, depending on who's counting. Sometimes people have it larger. But one of the largest freshwater ecosystems in the country, about the size of Okefenokee. So it's a very significant place. Now, I'm not going to talk too much more about that, and the reason is there's some really cool people over in Indiana that put this thing together. Maybe you have seen it. If you haven't, you should. The Everglades of the North, it's fabulous. Anything you want to know about the history and how things progressed through time, this is an outstanding piece of work. And some of the people who worked on it are in this room, right over there. So that's the definitive story, and you need to watch that. So we've gone through all this little song and dance here. Now, who else thinks this is important besides me? Well, here's some things that have been done over the years in Illinois. Illinois National Areas Inventory was done in 1978. I happened to work on that, believe it or not. A lot of the areas in in Kankakee Sands were on the inventory, Kankakee River, a lot of stuff up toward the park. And then some years later, the Illinois Natural History Survey, which is the largest institution of its type in the country, did a report called Resource-Rich Areas. All the Pembroke Savannas, Kankakee River are in that as well. The Nature Conservancy did its own analysis for its own purposes. Again, all the Kankakee places showed up again. And now today, both Indiana and Illinois have a wildlife action plan, which is funded partly through federal money, and they create these conservation opportunity areas based on resources and opportunity. And the Kankakee Sands, Moments, and all the rest of those, again, are in there. And then the most recent is what the Audubonists call their important bird areas. And both Medewan at this end is an Audubon important bird area, and Kankakee Sands down at the other end is also an important bird area. And that includes Moments as well. So it's a pretty important place. So what we're going to do now next is take kind of a tour down the river, which I mentioned early on. So let me get this to go. So here's Medewan again. We're coming down the river. Kankakee River is known for its smallmouth bass fisheries. It's one of the cleanest rivers in the state. When you get down to Kankakee River State Park, that's about 4,000 acres. It gets 1 million visitors a year. I wish it's a good thing they don't. 1 million visitors a year, which is one of the most visited parks in the state. When you get down to Kankakee and Bourbonnais and Bradley, they all get their drinking water from the Kankakee River. So it's an incredibly important place for a lot of reasons. When you get down to Aroma Park, a couple things here. This is one of the largest freshwater mussel beds in Illinois. It's full of a lot of really cool mussels, and I'll show you a picture of those in a minute. But also, this was a site for, and the Indian name I can't pronounce, so I'm going to use this English version. His name's called Mad Sturgeon. And in some of the old maps, there's an Indian village there called Moonpokes Village. But Mad Sturgeon was the Keystone guy who decided that they ought to go up and take care of Chicago, up Hubbard's Trace when they had the Chicago Massacre. He was the Potawatomi that said, let's do it, even though some of the other Indian chiefs said no. He's the one that sort of said, let's go, and they went up and had the Chicago Massacre. And then we're going to go up here to Moments. We're going to spend some time here, and then we'll go down into the savannas and then over here. So here's some mussels from the Kankakee River. These are all at the Aroma Park mussel bed. You got, excuse me, the spike, and whoops, I just lost my place. The black sand shell, purple wartyback. This is the one over here. When that's alive, that is actually purple. It is brilliantly purple. It's gorgeous. And then the sheep nose is this one right here, and that one is probably as abundant in the Kankakee River as is anywhere, and it's actually just now been added to the federal endangered species list. So in the Kankakee River area, you have 3, and one of them is the sheep nose, the other is Kankakee mallet, or not Kankakee mallet, the Illinois or leafy prairie clover, and shoot, what's the 4th one? I just forgot. Well, I'll come back to that when I think of it. Actually, Mike, is that you back there?
Yes, it is, Fran.
All right, so speaking of mussels, the guy just walked in. It's Mike Bronson. He's a former CPO for the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. He's one of the key guys that essentially helped us pass a law that said you couldn't use this for bait anymore. Because used to the guys that go out and they just break these open, use them for bait for catfish. Well, they couldn't tell an endangered one from an unendangered one. So with Mike's help, actually because he worked the Kankakee area, we were able to put together legislation that says you shouldn't do this anymore. Just go ahead and buy some chicken livers or something and use that for bait. So it's amazing he walked in just when he did. Perfect timing, Mike, as always. So the Kankakee River comes down like this, and you have all these tributaries. They're all sand bottom. Most of them are dished, as you probably know. But that's the bad news. The good news is they're still sand bottom, and the water's pretty clear. And because of that, the shiners, like these 3 guys right here, the weed shiner, iron colored, and black nose, are still pretty common, as things go, in those streams. But all 3 of these are on the Illinois Endangered Species List. But as long as those have sand bottoms and they're pretty much clear, these guys are hanging on pretty well. So this brings us up to moments. And here we are on this side with that straight line. You all know that it's been ditched, and if you watch that CD, you'll know all about that, how that came to be. But when you hit the Illinois line, it actually has its original course. So it's sinuous. It makes its turns, takes the energy out of the river, and it goes on and on like that. The state of Illinois owns a couple pieces of property there, Moments Nature Preserve and Moments Land and Water Reserve. They're two really cool places. And even though you think that Illinois, of all places, we've had great botanical exploration in the state from years and years, back to History Survey, like 100 and some years worth of stuff, they've been everywhere. In Moments Wetlands, just to show you how cool these places are on the Illinois side, they found 4 species new to the state, not new to the state, but that were never found up in this part of the state ever. And one is a swamp cottonwood. And this is Bill Glass, some of you might know him, and he's looking at swamp cottonwood right there. Now, I'll show you the difference. Everybody knows what a cottonwood leaf looks like. That's regular cottonwood on the left, that's swamp cottonwood on the right. And you can see the distribution. This plant is actually in the south, and it works its way up the Mississippi embayment and just barely gets in Illinois down in the Cache River swamps, where you'd expect to see it with bald cypress and tupelo. But here it is up on the Kankakee River near Moments. Well, between 1978 and 1991, Bill and some other folks found swamp cottonwood, American silverbell, climbing milkweed, and pumpkin ash. Those are all species from the south. You see them commonly in the cache. They're nowhere in central Illinois until you get up almost to the Kankakee, and here they are. So it's a remarkable place. Still finding things after all these years. I mean, there's still cool stuff out there to find in these wild places. But that's not really the important thing about the Moments wetlands. And even Indiana and into Indiana, where it's been straightened, there's still very thick and strong composition of oaks in the streamside forest. And this is really different than most of the streamside forests in Illinois and probably Indiana as well, where you get cottonwood, silver maple, and sycamore, which are fine trees, but they don't have the acorns that are really dependent, a lot of things are dependent on. A lot of insects eat the acorns. Acorns fall, a lot of small mammals eat those, and then what that does is drives another group of animals, particularly like these guys, the warblers, the Potawatomi, cavity neck-sing warbler goes along the streams in small cavities. Redstart, which is way up on the canopy, eating all the insects that are feeding on the acorns. And then the red-shouldered hawk, which is eating small mammals, reptiles, anything it can get, crayfish. If it can catch it, it'll eat it. Okay, so that's the Moments wetlands, and that's a significant part of the whole Kankakee Sands area. The next place we're going to talk about is actually the savannas. Whoop, I forgot this guy, sorry. Also along the Moments wetlands, all kinds of native wildflowers. If you've been up there when the cardinal flowers bloom, it looks like it's on fire. And if you're there just before that when the lizard tail is blooming, it's got this long white spire, and it looks like there's snow, which we're going to see at night again in one more snowstorm all along the river. Let's see if I missed another one here. Oh, I did. The other thing that's remarkable about this part of the state, both on the Indiana side and Illinois side, is we have 3 tree squirrels. And most of you are familiar with this guy. He's the bully squirrel, gray squirrel. Everybody has one. Every city has one. Then there's the fox squirrel. Some people call this a red squirrel, but don't do that anymore because there is a red squirrel. So this is a fox squirrel. It's the more aristocratic of squirrels. You find them really in prairie groves originally. They're like open habitats. They're not as crazy, energetic, and always running around like the gray squirrel. But here's the real red squirrel, this guy right here, and you can tell him because he has his white eye ring right here and a black racing stripe right here. None of these other guys have that. And he's about half their size, very energetic. It's thought to be exported from the state. It was refound on the Natural Areas Inventory, the first one that I worked on, in the Iroquois and Kankakee watersheds. The one place that I can guarantee you can see all 3 of these squirrels at once if you sit down and have lunch and spend about 45 minutes there is Island Park in Moments, which is just down the road from you guys if you're ever over there. Your backyard? All right. If you've seen them, then all 3 of them probably there. Yep, so there, validation.
What about that pitch black one, Fran? Is that a gray?
Yeah, the black ones are almost always, the most common black ones are melanistic forms of the gray squirrel. You can get them from the fox squirrel too, but the fox squirrel and they're melanistic, they're usually not totally black. And you'll see a lot of that color, this fox squirrel color in it. These guys can be totally black. Rock Island, Illinois is famous for them. There's a lot of towns famous for black squirrels. In Illinois, only Illinois is famous for its white squirrels, and they're gray squirrels. Yep, and there's some in Lawrence County, way south. There's some debate whether or not they're albinos or just albinistic. because they've been there forever, and albinos usually, they kind of ultimately, breed out because, it's a recessive gene. So, but usually the really dramatic colored ones are the gray squirrels, almost always. Okay, talk a little bit about savannas. Here's sort of a distribution of the savannas that we have, so to speak, the Midwestern, oak-type savannas, cross timbers down here and then up through here. So it gives you an idea. It was sort of along the Prairie Peninsula. The Prairie Peninsula sort of went like this all the way almost to the East Coast. But Illinois was right up through here, and we were right there on the line right there. So the savannas are, in Pembroke Township, are essentially dominated by black oak. This is a black oak savanna here. It's being surveyed. The natural areas inventory I mentioned earlier was actually redone just a couple of years ago. And this is a sample site going through that to re-sample this particular site. This is a black oak, and that's about as old as the black oaks get up there. You can see a really knotty looking bark. But if you look down here, you see that kind of like smooth area? That's a fire scar. That's many fire scars actually. And if you cut that off and high enough so you can still get some wood, you can actually count the rings and see how old it is, but you can also mark all the fires that have gone through there. So we actually had a study done, I'll talk more about that later, in the Kankakee savannas. But that's what a black oak savanna looks like. There's trees scattered, they're usually pretty big, but you can see all the evidence of fire right here. So there's a lot of fire dependency on these oak savannas. This particular cookie, the first year they could find a fire on here was 1906. And the reason is because black oaks don't live very long. 100 years is pretty long, especially in a community that's actually being fired. So they don't live very long, so it's hard to get past 1906 or a little later. Okay, this next slide, remember I said I worked on the first inventory in 1978? So here's a 1978 photo of the Big Dune Nature Preserve. See this road right here? Sand road. See the sand road here? 2009, 1978. This is Illinois. It's 2014. These places haven't changed in 31 years. It's a fire-dependent community that did not change in 31 years. That is unbelievable. And this is before TNC owned it. This is after TNC owned it, but it doesn't matter. It would have stayed the same, even if we didn't own it. Wildfires still go through here. Now, it's hard to believe there's still wildfires in Illinois, but there are. And this particular part of the Illinois is pretty frequent. And based on that study that fellow did, the average is 1 in 10 years a community experience fire again. So if you can imagine a fire every year somewhere, that's pretty remarkable. Even 1 in 10 years. And these aren't purposely set. They're not prescribed fire. These are actually wildfires. They have to be put out by volunteer fire departments. So that's an amazing set of photos to show how dependent these communities are on fire and how the Pembroke area essentially sustained itself. So where did all this fire come from? Well, originally the Potawatomis were here, and everything they did was fire. So sometimes it's hard to believe, but well, let me put it this way. Well, I think I have a slide just later on, but everything they did, they needed fire to do it, just like us. In those days, there could be wildfires. They could set fire on purpose, set fire to hunt, to get rid of insects. Anything you can think of that fire would be useful for, they did it. And think of it this way: if fire got out of hand, let's say there's pyromaniacs in today's world, they were in the previous world. So if somebody started a fire, there's no fire department to call. It burned. And if it wasn't burning up your village, so what? The next guy's got to take care of it. And they had ways to do that, actually, but they didn't run around and put them out. They let them burn out, or they set back fires like we would do to do a prescribed fire. After 1800, after settlement, the settlers did the same thing. They knew what kept the grasslands open. And if you were, I think his name was Lemieux Milk, had 65,000 acres here, all in grassland, essentially grazing the savannas. They burnt those to keep the grasses growing. They didn't want the shrubs to completely choke them out. So even after 1800, there's a lot of fires, and open burning is still practiced in Pembroke. You can still drive by and see a barrel shooting out flames as you drive by. And if it starts a fire, no one goes to put it out. They call the fire department. By the time they get there from St. Anne, Kankakee, wherever it is, Beaverville, it's burnt 20, 30, maybe 40 acres. And if it's really windy, it can be devastating. Houses are burnt down. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the birds in the savanna. Here's a lark sparrow. And the reason I chose this slide is mostly just because I found it kind of interesting, really. But these guys like open, park-like habitats with grasslands. But what's really neat about this slide is this is actually one of the savannas the Nature Conservancy owns down there. And this nest is made out of little bluestem, the native little bluestem, and it's being shaded by winged sumac. It's probably one of the few larkspur nests you'll find that actually is made out of natural, native vegetation. And there he is sitting on a blueberry bush. Okay, this guy, bobwhite quail, and you're probably familiar. Bobwhite quail is pretty much a southern bird. It is very common in the pine plantations in the south. The pine plantations in the south are very similar to the black oak savannas up here, right down to pocket gophers. But the difference is we got black oaks and they got a pine, but there's wiregrass underneath it. We got little blue stem under ours. A lot of legumes in the south, a lot of legumes in the black oak savannas. In Illinois, the largest call count a couple years ago for bobwhite quail was in the Pembroke savannas. Now that's incongruent. Southern Illinois is known for its quail, but some of the highest counts were actually in Kankakee. Let's talk about legumes. There's 21 native legumes in the Kankakee savannas. We had a study done, a floristic study not too long ago. Of those, 3 are Lespedezas, which that's the quail food. No matter where you go, everybody loves Lespedezas. There's 4 desmodiums. That's another little small seeded legume. And then there's, I said 3 Lespedeza. So the fact there's so many legumes there, the food is almost perfect for them. They like the habitat with the interspersed trees and some of the shrubs. And they like sand because it's easy to dust themselves to get the ectoparasites off. So those are all the reasons. Plus, there's not a lot of heavy hunting on quail down there, so they're not hunted very hard, so the coveys aren't broke up. So it's a perfect situation for those guys, even though it's sort of the northern edge of the range. Whoop, wrong button. Okay, so here's sort of like a mugshot of what we call savanna birds that you'll see down there. Quite a few of them: lark sparrow, bobwhite quail, red-headed woodpecker, bluebird, summer tanager, and the orchard oriole. And this guy over here, the red-headed woodpecker, sort of the same story as the woodpecker, or the quail. We had a study done on those guys as well, and it turns out some of the highest concentrations of red-headed woodpeckers are in the savannas. And red-headed woodpeckers are tanking all over, even in city parks, which is essentially a savanna with mowed grass, if you think about it, scattered big trees. Well, it turns out the researchers decided that the reason the savannas were so perfect for these guys is sort of indirectly related to fire. All kinds of perfectly sized trees that are dying and have cavities in them. So the fire, starts to kill them. They start to die. It makes them easy to put holes in. These guys use those. There's a cavity nested bird, obviously. It's a woodpecker. So that's the summer story. But the winter story is that there's so many different acorns, the pin oaks, the swamp white, and the bur oak, particularly pin oak, though, the pin oak acorns and the black oaks, they're about, they're smaller. They cache them in the winter. The red-headed woodpeckers actually cache them. So I've never seen an acorn failure in the Kankakee Sands, never. There's always just tons of them. So these guys cache them, and they spend their winter in the savannas. It's a great place to be. It's out of the wind, plenty of food. So they're doing pretty good there. Wherever else, they're kind of failing. Oh, the other thing that I don't have a slide of, unfortunately, but another bird everybody's interested in all of a sudden is whippoorwills. And if you've been in the Kankakee Sands at night, you hear whippoorwills. It's another bird that's hanging on there, and you can't hear it anywhere else unless you go to southern Illinois, where it'll drive you crazy if you're camping. But whippoorwills are also in the in the savanna area is another community type that we don't talk a lot about because it's almost gone. They're small. The largest probably chunk of it, these are pin oak flatwoods, sand flatwoods, is in the Iroquois County Conservation Area on the Illinois side. There's a lot of them here. As I drove over today, I saw a lot of them, but they've been sort of drained a little bit, and you can see they're not in as good a shape. But these are pin oaks. They have a small acorn. And this was probably a major community in pre-settlement time, but it's been removed for farming in a lot of places. But you can see even when it's greening up here in the spring, here it doesn't look like anything's happened. It's like it's been flooded, and it has been. But it doesn't have a clay pan like the flatwoods as you get to southern Illinois. Actually, the water's being pushed up. It gets full, and it pops up, and that keeps things from growing for a while. So these are the sand flatwoods. Pin oak flatwoods is another way to call them. These guys are important for a lot of reasons, and here's 3 of them. In the fall migration, these mixed flocks of blackbirds, like the bruised blackbird, the cowbird, and the purple grackle, will just be full in these flatwoods. They just love picking out those little acorns when they're migrating. If you're in Moments wetlands, they'll be just full through there. You might even see a rusty blackbird mixed in with them. So again, it's these acorns, it's the oaks in this community, these ecosystems that are so critical to a lot of other things that depend on them. Okay, next thing I'm going to talk a little bit about is geographic oddities. Whoop, I got too many buttons, folks. So here's a lot of animals actually dead in on their distributions in the Kankakee Sands. There's like 30 of them, if you can imagine. 30 animals end up stopping their distributions in the Kankakee Sands. And here's a few. The ornate box turtle came from the west. This one's really weird. It actually, there's a space between here and there, so it got cut off somehow. And the isolated populations in the Kankakee Sands and the Pembroke area around there. Another one that's almost similar to that is the Plains pocket gopher. Comes up like this, goes over there and just stops. It just barely gets into Indiana. The interesting thing about, well, there's a lot of interesting about pocket gophers, but you see how dark this guy is? He's almost black. That's an Illinois subspecies. As you go west, they're brown. And we actually have our own subspecies. The pocket gopher is named after Illinois in a subspecies level. So he's really different in color. And the reason is because he's in very dark soil. So he's essentially adapted his color of his fur to be black as opposed to the lighter soils as you go west. Orange friend orchid, it's a northern species pretty much. You can see it all down here, but there's a gap, but probably the ones we have are come down from the north. That represents endangered species. There's 58 endangered species either listed on Indiana's list or Illinois' list in this area. That's phenomenal, 58. And then, all right, this is a glass lizard. It's not a snake. It's a lizard, actually. It looks like a snake, doesn't have legs. But you can't stare down a snake because it doesn't have eyelids. You can stare down this guy, he'll blink at you. So that's how you can tell him. Plus the ear opening, which is, I can't see it, but there's an ear hole right there. If he has that, it's a lizard. Okay, I mentioned there was 30 of these different animals and plants that end up in the Kankakee Sands at the end of their ranges. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the pocket gopher, and he's our unlikely ecosystem engineer. He's different from a mole. If you've probably all seen a mole, your cat brought him in or your dog. You can't see an eye on a mole. They have them, but you can't see them. If you skinned them out, you'd see it. But they're very unfunctional. This guy's got an ear. You can't see the ears on moles either. They have them. If you skin them out, you'll see the ear hole. But they have no external ears. Like, you know, this is not your ear. Your ear's in there. If this was gone, you can still hear. So you can't see them on a mole, but you can see them on these guys. And a mole has great big, like catcher's mitt hands and claws. But these guys have regular claws. He comes out at night. The reason we know that is we find his skulls in owl pellets. So they come out at night and fool around when they shouldn't, and they get caught. So why is he an unlikely engineer? Well, it seems impossible. Something this small, they're only about this big, sometimes a little bigger, can be considered an ecosystem engineer. But you see all these white things here? Those are all pocket gopher mounds. Want to make a guess how many pocket gopher mounds are in that picture? 50. 50 of them. All right, so that still might not be impressive, but this next slide ought to give you an indication of how much. These guys don't hibernate. They work every month of the year. They're always busy. So here is an aerial shot. This is a wildfire line right here. You see all these white marks? Those are all pocket gophers. See, they're up here too, but you can really see them down here against that black. So here's sort of the ironic thing about this. These guys are like beavers. They're changing the environment, but not as dramatic as a beaver does. When a beaver makes his dam, you can see this big flood, and you go, oh my God, that's amazing. These guys are doing it subtly. But if this was a nature bird, and there was a guy out there with a shovel going, we'd have him arrested, right? He'd be digging up the prairie, turning it over, essentially plowing it. These guys are plowing the prairie. So they're really changing it, but they're changing it for the better. Because this is sand, so it's really depauperate in nutrients. So when these guys are eating their vegetation, they're pulling it down the hole, and they keep bringing it back up, putting it down, bringing it back up. So they're actually essentially working the soil to make it better, even though it's sand. The other thing that's kind of neat, if you're ever out there and you see a big old fresh one, especially when it's been there for a little bit, like a couple days, it'll start to be white on top. Well, you can see how white they are. You feel that, and it's like a sidewalk. It is hot. You stick your hand in there, and about, I don't know, maybe 6 inches down, it's cold. Not only is it cold, but it's wet. So they're moving water up and down, too, just by aerating the soil. It's amazing all the stuff that these guys do from an engineering standpoint. It's underappreciated. See anything else about those guys? Oh, yeah. Let's see what's next. So this is a little plant called Flower of the Hour. Let's see. I can't see it myself. I'm too much of an angle. Oh, right there. See it? It's literally, that big. It's not as big as a pencil. But see where it's growing? It's on a pocket gopher mound. See those? So these guys can't, you can tell, they can't take much competition. So when the pocket gopher makes a mound, these guys will wind up seeding in there and they can grow and actually fruit. And it's called Flower of the Hour because it only blooms for about an hour. Seeds form, drops down the pocket gopher mound, starts over again. If the pocket gopher wasn't there, I think a lot of these plants would be gone. And there's a good example in Mason County, Illinois, which is another sandbox we have over there. And the pocket gophers are pretty much gone. And there's a plant there called Old Plainsman, which is really common in the Kankakee Sands area. It's pretty much gone. And I'm pretty sure it's going to have to do with two things. One is pocket gophers are declining over there. And second, they used to have sand roads everywhere, just like Pembroke, and now they're all asphalt. If you drive down a sand road when the Old Plainsman is blooming in Kankakee Sands, they'll be all along the road, almost like ragweed. It benefits from that disturbance in the sand. Now, I'll show you a little something about that later. So here's another thing the pocket gopher does. It makes habitat for these plants that can't stand a lot of competition. Oh, now I'm going to talk a little bit about a fire anomaly here. So here's the regal fritillary on the left, which is an endangered butterfly, I think on both sides. I'm pretty sure it is on both sides. It definitely is in Illinois. And so this plant right here is a violet, bird's foot violet. This animal's larva is deposited, seeds, or the larvae, eggs are put on the bottom of these near the roots, not under the soil, but right on the soil level. And when they hatch, they start to feed on the violet. Trouble is, if a fire goes through and they're down here, you would think they'd be very susceptible to that fire. It was just like kill them off. In Kankakee, in the Pembroke area, when these guys are flying, I can guarantee you, any place you go, you're going to see them. And the reason is because there's so much of divergence of fire, there's always a resilient population, so they recolonize. But even more importantly, guess where this violet's growing? On a pocket gopher mound. So you can see the fire's coming, hits that pocket gopher mound, what's it do? Goes around, because there's no fuel. There's nothing to burn. So there's a lot of things that actually play into this that are sort of subtle that sometimes actually make a big difference if you're a larva of a regal fritillary, in this case. Okay, let's see. Okay, since the regal is an endangered species, we'll talk a little bit about that. This is the orange-fringed orchid. Its largest population, really hundreds and hundreds of plants, is on a property Nature Conservancy owns. It represents 58 species that are listed either in Illinois and Indiana that are found in this area. That's a huge number of listed species. And not too long ago, again from the Natural History Survey, we had to do some work up there. They rediscovered a plant that we thought was exportated from the state, sort of like the red squirrel back in '78 when the inventory guys found it. They found it up in the sands, in the Kankakee Sands as well. And I don't have a picture of that with me. Well, I might, but I don't think it's in the slide right now. But it, whoops, oh, well, that's all right. This is Kankakee mallow. If you're not familiar with that, that's a species of mallow that's only found on an island in the Kankakee River near Kankakee River State Park. It's one of the rarest plants in the world. And the good news with this plant, it really grows well from seed. If you take a seed and plant it, it'll grow pretty well. And they've got a lot of collections of its seed down at the History Survey and some other places. Three other plants, primrose violet and the yellow wild indigo is the one they rediscovered, and Kerry smartweed, which is if you're a farmer, you all know what smartweed looks like. This one's kind of unique in its morphology. But primrose violet, yellow wild indigo, Kerry smartweed, Kankakee mallow are all restricted to the Kankakee Sands area. You don't find it anywhere else in Illinois. It's all in the Kankakee Sands. So I'm going to talk a little about restorations. And usually when we talk about landscape restorations or any kind, there's four things we almost always do, should always do. We look at the original survey notes and the maps, which are pretty interesting things all by themselves. We look at what remnants are out there, like Iroquois County Conservation Area, sometimes old cemeteries that haven't been plowed, soil maps, and then again the fire history. These are all the things that are important to know before you start a restoration. Okay. Here's an example of 1833 surveyor's note. This is Thomas Jefferson's idea, if you didn't know this little part of the history. When Lewis and Clark made their big trip and came back, had all this land, Jefferson says, well, how are we going to sell this so we know what we're selling and the government gets their due and everybody knows where they're at? He came up with the idea we'd do land surveys, square miles. So next thing that happened was all this land was surveyed. And of course we were in the West then. So these guys would actually go out and walk down section lines and they'd describe them. They measure them and describe them. And every quarter section they put in either a post or dirt, depending if they were in prairie or if they were in woods. They'd use witness trees, measure them, identify the trees so the guys behind them could figure it out. They sent their notebooks to St. Louis and then they made maps. It was an amazing feat that this was all done. So this is an example of a log for one of the guys going down a section line in Kankakee Sands. Timber lands high and gently rolling, soil sandy and poor but fit for cultivation. Timber, white oak, black oak, without understory and of poor quality. So you can see they essentially, you can walk that same line now and feel like you just went down the survey route. It's remarkable how similar the land is today based on their descriptions. But after they went through the savannas, they'd come down off the savannas and hit these wet prairies and sedge meadows. And they'd write wet prairie, wet swamp, and then they'd say unfit for cultivation because it's too wet. This is before tiles, before ditches, and these guys are all from the east. They were used to farming woodlands, but so they figured that dry sand was going to be worth farming. Well, of course, it turned out to be the other way. They realized they couldn't farm in that sand, and when they figured out that the Irish were able to come over and dig the ditches, and then they came up with tile, then that wet area became farmable, at least most of the time, and then they turned out to be just the opposite of what they thought. And here's what that would look like. Whoop. Oh, here's the map. I forgot about the map. So here's an example of a pre-settlement map. And there's a couple things on here. Here's a section line where they were going along, and see they hit this, and it was a prairie. So all around this is savanna, but when they hit that prairie, they actually wrote something about it. Like they might say, a prairie fit for cultivation, but damnedest thicket of hazel rough I've ever been in. And they'd make all kinds of annotations like that. Some of the guys wrote eloquently. I mean, it's like reading a book. It's like you were just with them. It's great. Other guys, you can't even read their handwriting. It's sometimes so bad you wonder how they ever translated it. So here's a section line. It was either probably savanna through here, and then it hit another prairie. But here's one that's kind of cool. Big Spring Swamp. If you go there today, there's a ditch right through here, and it's called Big Spring Ditch. So that was a big wetland, just part of the Greater Kankakee Swamp, and it was drained, and now that's all farm. Here's the other thing these old maps show you. This says State Road from Vincennes to Chicago. That's Hubbard's Trace right there, and that's probably exactly where it was. And we may actually own a square mile of this in the near future, and if we do, that'd be very interesting to have somebody get his metal detector and walk through that. No telling what you might find. So back to well, here, let me show you that again, because I kind of got off there. So this guy's walking along. Here he is. He's in this savanna. He thinks this is poor soil but fit for cultivation. Then he hits here. Here's kind of what that would look like to him if he was walking. If he was walking this way, he's in the rolling, sandy, poor, dry, sandy, fit for cultivation. And when he hits this, he goes, nope, it's no good. Can't plow it, can't farm it. And then he hits the savanna again, and he'd go up. This was actually taken in 2009 when it is ditched. This shows you how that sand just pushes water up. These like sand wells are really easy to hit water. That's essentially what's happening here. But that's already farmed. But you can see how wet that is even now. You can imagine how wet it was without artificial drainage. Okay, I'm going to show you a little bit about the fire and remnants. This is Iroquois County Conservation Area. Essentially 4 sections of pre-settlement land. It's a fabulous place. Mike used to work down there all the time. This is Blazing Star, and what's significant about these bigger places is it's just not a handful of individual plants. There's thousands. You can see this goes all the way back to those trees. And this is a pin oak flatwoods here, and this will be full of those grackles and cowbirds and rusty blackbirds in the fall. But there's literally thousands of these plants here. And if you look underneath them, you're going to find things like sundew, which is a really unusual plant. It's one of those insectivorous plants. So this is where you would go to decide what kind of plants you would need to do a restoration if you were starting from scratch. Whoop, fat finger. These are the soil maps. These are amazing things, and one of the best things the United States government ever did. USDA makes these, that's Soil Conservation Service. And so these little numbers correspond to a soil type, and they'll tell you more about that particular soil than you ever want to know. But it tells you all kinds of chemical responses, pH, acidity, how wet it is, permeability, all kinds of things. So like those blazing stars, that picture's taken in here. So that particular soil type is a wet prairie. If you go over here to 501, you're going to find more calyxes, and that'll be a sedge meadow. And you'll see a lot of the sundews in there on the little peat moss elevated areas. So it gives you an example of what the soil profiles look like. Here's the sand savanna profile. It's like 3 inches of organic matter, that dark stuff. And it's really dry sand, all the way down to China. And here is the flatwoods. You can see there's a big difference. 6 inches of topsoil, maybe a little more. And it's really black, and it's wet, and even the sand below it's wet. And these are taken the same day in the Iroquois County Conservation Area. So there's a lot of things happening underground that affects the plants above ground, as you guys probably all know. Okay. Now we're going to move into Indiana now, after I tell you about some fire. I've got another slide I changed from yesterday. Here's that thesis I was telling you about. Cody Constantine did this in 2009. The earliest fire scar was in 1906, and of 129 fire intervals, they ranged from 1 to 10 years. That's just remarkable in this part of the world. I mean, it's hard to believe. Now this is important because somewhere down the road, when things start to change, and as change always happens in these interesting places, there's going to be interest in, well, why should we keep burning here, and what's the benefit, and well, what's the history of it? We'll actually have that. It'll be a document somewhere somebody can go find, and we'll know, because if we wait for another 20 years, then we won't have that 1906 number. It'll be 1926, and by then things had really changed. Lemieux was here with all, even before that, but things changed dramatically from the 1900s. When you get in the 1930s, drought and a lot of other things happened. So we're going to move into Indiana. You're probably all familiar with this slide, those of you that put together the CD. We're going to talk a little bit about Beaver Lake, which is right here, 12 to 15,000 acre lake, just gigantic lake. And if you watch the CD, you'll learn how they actually drain this. They put a ditch through here, and off the water went, and they farmed it. It was an incredible thing they did. But a few years ago, probably I think 15 now, maybe 18, the Nature Conservancy bought 8,000 acres of that land from the potential company. And the idea there was to connect some natural areas. There are several nature preserves and natural areas in Indiana, and then there was Willow Slough in Iroquois County, and they were trying to connect them so there would be this corridor. Because by then we'd realized that area sensitivity was a big deal, that a lot of animals, not just birds, needed big tracts of land to be successful, to take care of stochastic events. Like if you have a 40-acre prairie and the whole thing burns, you might have got rid of every insect there for a very long time. That's why we burn them in half or in quarters or in thirds, so that we don't get rid of everything in 1 year and keep the fire and keep the animals all there. So here's an aerial shot of that, 8,000 acres. This is a lake bottom. So it's not like working with a piece of prairie soil. You're working with an unknown medium. It's essentially lake soil, lake bottom. So there's a lot of things to consider. We did all those things you talked about, looked at soil maps and all the rest of it, and tried to do a restoration to make this connection work pretty well. So big restorations take big equipment, and it's expensive equipment. And a lot of times folks are surprised when they see a big bulldozer or something out on a prairie restoration, like, what? These are the things that destroyed them. Well, actually the things that destroyed them are actually very useful to put them back together. I know it's sometimes hard to believe. But it is big machinery, it's big business, a lot of money, but it's worth it in the long run. Now also, we have extra help on these things, and you're going to be surprised when you see this next guy. We call these guys conservation cows. And we have been doing a lot of grazing at Medewan. We have about 1,000 head of cattle grazing on about 4,500 acres of land. And you can see behind you how short that grass is. Upland sandpipers love that particular height. And if you mow it, it does not have the same effect as if you have a cow grazing it. And a cow grazing doesn't have the same effect if you have a bison grazing it, believe it or not. And none of those grazers are a substitute for fire. They actually are, they need to all be together. But this guy's at Medewan. He's grazing happily. Actually, he's probably a hamburger by now, but he was there. So these guys are at Kankakee, and that's a sand savanna back there. This is a restoration, and these guys, there's, let's see, we think we have 45 head of cattle grazing 310 acres here. And if you're good with math and you're dividing out those 1,000 into 4,500, it's not good to do that because it depends on what they're on. So if this is a real high productivity soil, you can put more cows and calves per acre than you can in another place that has lower productivity because grass doesn't get as high. So you can't make that just assumption across the board. But these guys are at Kankakee. That's a little savanna in the background. I don't think they can graze that. They're just grazed in that restoration. The difference between cows and bison is cows actually like to eat the forbs, and so they're not the native grazer. The bison actually like to eat grass, and they sort of avoid forbs as long as there's enough grass to eat. They'll eat them, but if the grass is there, they prefer the grass. Cow prefer the forbs. So it's kind of it's okay, but it's not the best to have just cattle grazing. Okay. Oh, I think I mentioned this already, but I'll show it to you again. This is a quote from a guy who's written many, many books on the history of fire, particularly in the United States and the West. But it's a great way to view it. Of all the animals in the world, humans are the only ones entrusted to do fire. And so all those communities, all those animals out there that need fire in a community are depending on us, to have fire in the ecosystem. We also have the power to almost eliminate it completely if we wanted to. I mean, you can never really do it completely, but you could eliminate it. If you think back in the Smoky Bear days, they pretty much eliminated in the forest in the west, and that came back to haunt them big time, and it still is to some degree. When they used to call it Paiute fires, when the Indians were actually running the show, they were burning these woods all the time for a lot of reasons other than just, fire to fire. They were doing it for habitat for grazing animals that they used to eat, needed them, but they also knew that it was a way to keep the fires from being devastating. And so if they had houses and villages, if it was a grass fire, it's no big deal. You just start a backfire and it's done. If it's solid, really heavy, tinder firewood and it starts to burn, you can't even get close to it. It's going to destroy everything. So fire's not a substitute. The grazing is not a substitute. Mowing is not a substitute. Fire is important. It does things that we don't even still understand. Critical to these fire communities. All right. So from fire, let's go to wetlands. Back in the water where we're safe. Here again, big equipment. This was actually Muskota Land and Water Reserve. And this was 640 acres, a square mile. There's about 300 acres of savanna and about 300 acres of farmland inside it. And we've restored all that. And in the center, there was these 2 ditches. And luckily, they weren't tied to the universal drainage system. They were just there to drain those fields, so we could close them off. So we dug them up, closed them out, and in the spring, this is what it looks like. It comes up like it's supposed to. All that water comes to the surface. Get a lot of shorebirds that come in. And you can see we did some restoration with planting, like the blazing stars, and they're coming back. So it's kind of like shake and bake in those wetlands. If you can get the water back, good things happen. There's not too many exotic species around, although I did see loosestrife last year in the Kankakee, which I don't know where that came from. It's not the river, it is up there, but in the Pembroke ditches and stuff, it's kind of surprising to see it. And there's reasons for that. But that's what the wetland restoration work would look like. It starts up here, it looks like you're just playing in the mud. And then there's got this big water thing, and then there's a spring, starts to happen, and then 3 or 4 years later, this happens. So, how do you know if you're winning? How do you know if you're successful? Well, we do a lot of scientific monitoring. We sample a lot of stuff, and that's a pretty good way of showing it, but this is probably the best way to see it. If you go out on these restorations, you're seeing great spangled fritillaries and sedge wrens. That means they like it, probably means you're doing well. And so that's probably the best way to really look at and see how successful you're going to be. Okay, to wind down a little bit, I'm going to talk about threats. This is not the most fun part of these things, but these are all threats that are common to a lot of places, and some are a little bit different than others. But urban sprawl is certainly something that can come to the Kankakee Sands, anytime. If the 3rd airport in Illinois happens, the Illinois Highway, a lot of things could, create speculation, bring new people for whatever reason, usually jobs. Exotics, there's not a lot of exotics in the Kankakee sand, the really dry sands, because most of the exotics that were brought over for landscaping purposes, 2 things. One, they can't afford to buy them, so they don't have them. But second, they don't do very well in really dry conditions. They like more mesic stuff, more like standard garden type soil, not real drouthy sand. So we have some, and there'll be more, but not as bad as some places. Burn bans, we talked about this, remember that thesis? So we know how often these places burnt, they kept them like they are. 40 years from now, it looks like this, and someone's saying, well, we shouldn't be burning this, it's a very dangerous thing, blah, 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 smoke. We'll have a record that says, well, the reason these places are like they are is because they were burnt, we should keep doing it. We'll wind up in court, we'll have this document that'll help us win. The other thing that's kind of unusual in terms of a threat is irrigation, and that has 2 effects. One is we talked about those flat woods where all the pin oaks are, and the water comes up, floods it in the spring. Well, irrigation has a tendency to lower the water table, so it may not get to the surface anymore, and that may change the top. We can't prove that yet, but probably when we can prove it, it'll be too late. But the other thing it does directly is there used to be these little savannas sitting out in these 40 and 20 acre fields. When they start to irrigate them, that arm, you see this arm here, that pivots. It goes like this. That's what it sounds like. Well, if there's a savanna right there, and the arm's coming around, guess what happens? Can't go. So a lot of those have been bulldozed away. That sand dune's been flattened and the sand sold off so that arm can go around. If they do more and more irrigation, more and more of those are going to be gone. Roadkill. Here's an ornate box turtle. Bull snakes are run over all the time. This is one of our preserves. There's 2 things in this picture. One is there's some ATV damage. Even when we put this in, they took them out. We got rid of them, and I'll show you a picture of that. They're not on our property anymore, but they are elsewhere. But see this road goes by it, a sand road? You couldn't drive more than 20 miles an hour on that road. And Michael, remember this, you just can't get up ahead of speed on these sand roads. That's now a blacktop road. So now not only can you go faster, you can run over a bull snake and a turtle and all in 2 minutes if you want to, when they're trying to cross. So that's an odd thing to have happen, but it actually does have a major effect because these guys are rare animals to begin with. So if you're running over, you've made a dent. So here, you're not going to like this picture. There's a look of ATV damage on land in Pembroke, and the really bad news is this mostly is private property. And it's owned by absentee landowners, and they don't even know this is going on. There are some landowners that actually have ATV facilities that you pay and go do it. But some of them are just, renegade deals like this. So it's not a small thing, it's actually a major thing. The thing about sand, though, and I'm not saying this to say that things are going to all work out, but they might. Sand is, again, there's not very many exotic species. Sand has a way to recover very quickly because everything around it is native. So the stuff that comes back in, it's going to be native. There actually is a lot of rare plants that'll show up on these. But too much is too much, and well, that's just wrong to begin with. Let's see. Oh, okay, this next picture kind of gives a bigger picture. So here's the proposed South Suburban Airport in Illinois. Here you guys are over here somewhere. That's about 20,000 acres. They're actually going to try and put it in here at one time, but we told them to go find someplace else a long time ago. But anyway, that's still in the books, and now there's this Indiana Highway that's going to do something like this. They wanted a chunk of this too, but we pushed them off. So it's going to do something like that. If both those things go, it'll have an effect not only on what happens maybe down here, but it'll have a direct effect on the Kankakee River because they intend to take water for the airport out of the river. Because I mentioned, Kankakee, Bradley, they all get their water from that. It's a great river. It's very good water. So if they do that, that'll make a huge drain on the river because it'll be gallons and gallons, hundreds of thousands of gallons of water for that. Okay, I'm going to end on sort of a future thing here. Bison that appear near you. Both Medewan, which we talked about quite a bit tonight, is looking to reintroduce bison. October 14th is the goal. I think they'll be a little later than that. If you're familiar with Nachusa grasslands, which is over in the western part of the state, it's about 2,500 acres. Nature Conservancy owns that. We're definitely on schedule, and we'll have bison grazing there in 2014, October. So that'll be a great field trip when that's open to the public again. We'll let the bison get acclimated before we do that. But both places are going to do it. The goal is to use wind cave bison because they're essentially free of cow genes. So this is actually, you can get all kinds of bison, just like bison, but they all got cow genes in them. So the idea here is to be able to help create these populations of cow gene bison populations around the country so we can keep that native strain of bison going without any cow genes in it. And wind cave is the one that's the cleanest that we know of. There's one in Canada too, but we're working with the Park Service with the wind cave guys. So with that, thank you. And here's a picture of a red-headed woodpecker sitting on one of our fence posts at Nachusa. I thought that, or not Nachusa, at Muskota Land and Water Reserve. So he's happy and we're happy. So I guess we're doing good things there too. So I'll be happy to try and answer any questions you guys might have.
Your conservation cows.
Yeah.
If there's such a benefit, why is it that people in WRPs aren't allowed to graze?
That might, well, WRP, I don't know, but they're actually talking about changing it for the grassland reserve guys in the current farm bill. I have to read it, but there is going to be some changes on grazing. Well, the difference is it's the intensity. So in our case, we're at Medewan, the cows are there for a conservation purpose, not for a beef purpose. So the number one thing is that we decide how many cows and calves are going to be on an allotment to benefit the birds. And then the farmer bids on that. And so if it's short grass, there might be a few more cows on that 40 acres than if we wanted tall grass, it'd be a few less. Now, that's worked pretty good. So far, so good. And there's really no other way to do that I can think of. But once in a while, I have a farmer that actually have an allotment and doesn't put his cows out early enough to benefit the birds. So we're trying to work through the contract so we can tighten that up so that, if they don't do that, there's a penalty. Because we want them there for the birds, not for whatever reason above that. So that's how we kept agriculture in the mix at Medewan. If we didn't have the cows, the whole thing would just blow up the shrubs and there'd be no birds.
Would you like borrow the cows?
No, it's a lease. So we put a request for bids for so many acres, so many cows per acre, and you're a farmer, and you go, oh man, I could expand my my cow-calf operation here by 1,000 acres. I mean, you just can't do that anywhere in Illinois anymore. So they'd bid on it, and so there'd be these bids, and whoever gets, well, not always the lowest bid, but technically, the lowest bid, they would win it. They'd have it for a year. They do good, you might get it for 2 years the next time, and that's how we do it.
You talked about the combination of the cattle grazing, so are you using them at the same time or the cows at one time? I mean, I understand prescribed birds because we do those.
Yeah, are they burning and having fire and grazing?
No, the cattle. So you have the cow and what was the other?
Oh, cow-calf?
Yeah.
Well, usually that's the ratios are called cow-calf per acre. That's a Western term. And so if you have a cow that's going to have a calf, you want to have enough food for the cow and the calf.
Sure.
So let's say a cow can eat an acre. So you're going to have a cow-calf would be an acre and a half. So then when you run the numbers, you want to make sure there's enough for every cow and if they have a calf. Some abort so you don't get them, but that's generally what we do. Some guys just do feeder calves, and all they want is acres for calves. Let them get fat and breed up and they're gone. But other guys want to do cows that are already bred. And
So they favor fours.
yeah, they do, unfortunately. Now, if they don't have forbs, it doesn't matter to them. They'll still eat grass. And in the day when there's 9,000 acres of old grassland. It's essentially cool season grasses. And they've restored about 3,000 of that to tall grass prairie. They graze on the old pastures where the cows always were. So they're essentially eating grass. And the Chusa, we're kind of doing a little different. There are some native remnants there, and then we restored a lot of land, about 1,000 acres, and they're going to graze on about 2,000 of it. So what we did there is we sampled all that before we going to put the bison on there. So we know what's there. And when the bison go on, they'll resample that to see if the bison are negatively affecting the restorations or worse yet, the actual remnants. If they are negatively affecting the remnant, and the only way I can see that happens if they, bison like to wallow, and get all the bugs off. If they decide to wallow in a remnant, that could be a problem. But on the other hand, if you think back to the pocket gopher mounds, so bison are essentially, engineers too. When they do that wallow, they're essentially creating habitat for those annuals to get back in undisturbed soil and grow without a lot of competition. So a lot of ins and outs to it. But that's what we're going to do in the Chusa, and we'll sample that and we'll watch that. And we got staff right on site. We got something like 35 volunteers that might as well be full-time employees. They're unbelievable. They're there all the time.
So nutritious, do you think? They're going after it for some of that nutritional value or just going to it?
The cows?
Yeah.
I don't know. It just tastes good. I mean, they eat grass too, but if you saw the two graze at the same time, you'd know bison were over here and cows were over here. The other thing cows do that bison don't do, this is a big deal at Medavin because it's Forest Service land, but this whole business of water and grazing in water, well, cows are really from the subtropics. They're like Indian animals, Indian continent. So they'll stand in water and they'll poop in water. They like it. They'll stand right there and be cool. Bison, if they stand in water, their hooves or their feet, but their feet rot. So they want to be up on the hill where the wind is, keep the bugs off. And they won't stand in water. They go out and drink, but then they leave. The cows will stand in the water, poop in the water, and that's bad. So we got to fence all that. So that's a lot of money.
Ted Anger with TNC in Newton County, a year or two ago, he told me they were hoping to get bison
Oop.
at the Kankakee Sands.
Yep, this was the beginning of that, to see how these guys would do, and ultimately, lead to a bison. Now, I don't know how much farther along they are than that, but they were thinking about it.
Oh, that'd be nice.
And I don't know how much land they're going to have it on, but I think this is 400 and some acres, that allotment right there. That's right next to the high school, or I think it's the high school, yeah.
Would the bison be a lease sort of thing too, or would you own them?
At Medavin, the Forest Service is going to own them, and at Chusa, we're going to own them. And the reason that is because of the wind cave stock, and you just can't go get those. So we have a big MOU with the National Park Service, and it's an agreement. We're going to get so many cows, or so many animals, after so many roundups, and then there's a protocol for moving them around. Nature Conservancy has them at Dunn Ranch, Dunn Ranch is in Missouri, Broken Kettle is in Iowa, then the Chusa, then Medavin. And the reason that works out pretty good, the geography of that is, when your little herd starts to grow, you got to get rid of some of them. And so we can move them around and keep the genetics strong. And they all got, today it's amazing. They got these little chips in their ears. You can't even see, you saw that conservation cow with the big tag. They don't have that. You wouldn't even see it. But they got a little chip in their ear. When they go through their annual little inspection, you run this recorder over, just like going to the grocery store. It tells you their sex, their age, last time they did this, last time they did that, last time they pooped, you know, everything. So it's amazing what you can do today with this, like, you know, high-tech stuff. It's amazing. The other thing we're doing, the Chusa, and this is just mostly for those of you that know Temple Grandin. Does anybody know Temple Grandin? Yeah. Well, you know, she designed all that stuff for cows to make it, you know, the corrals and stuff, you know, more cow-friendly as they're being processed and on. Well, we've been working with her in the Chusa, and it turns out we've actually improved on something that she's endorsed. And, you know, these are all herd animals, and if you can picture, you know, cows going in a semicircle, it used to be they had slats, so when the cow was coming around, he'd see you guys standing out there going, oh, that's a nice looking cow, and they'd freak. So, you know, she's the one that said, well, get that out of there so they can't see you, and they'll be easier to handle, and that worked out. And since they're herd animals, they just follow each other's butts around. So with the bison, it turned out we have a lot of expertise with bison around the country. They were finding that they were just a little bit quicker. And if you ever worked around bison, you know, cows, you know, they're like big Labradors. Bison's fast. Not only fast, but they're quick. And they can turn immediately. You know, you can't catch them. So they decided that what they wanted to do is make that run shorter, because on that curve, they can get up, you know, 5 miles an hour. So they made these little zigzags, and so when he comes like this, and he sees the tail go that way, so he goes, oh, and he has to stop to go around. Then he starts to go, oh, there's another corner, he's got to go around. So it actually took the speed out of it for the bison, and she thought that was great, so that's what we're going to do. It's kind of cool.
You mentioned quail and how the Kankakee Sands seems to be compatible for quail, but you didn't mention pheasant.
Never saw a pheasant up there.
Pheasants aren't native.
Well, they're not native, but, you know, they've naturalized.
Yeah.
Mike, I mean, other than when people release them, you know, they do that.
Not in Pembroke.
Yeah, I've never seen a pheasant there.
You see coveys of quail, but you don't see pheasants.
Yeah.
See, on my place, I've had coveys of quail last year, so I haven't heard too many, but I've only seen 2 pheasants in 12 years, 2.
And they might have been released, you know, by somebody else nearby.
In Nebraska, we talked to some DNR people, the equivalent in Nebraska, and they actually plant like Chinese plants, because their thing is quail, or I mean pheasants, you know, they make a lot of money from pheasant hunting. So they don't plant like native plants, because they're from Asia, so they plant more Asian.
Well,
They had some bad feelings about that.
yeah, well, the correlation isn't that the pheasants are from China and the food's from China. It just turns out that that's where they're from.
Yeah.
They like legumes. So the argument's always been, well, we can get these non-native Lespedizas, even though we got, you know, 4 or 5 native ones. We can get these non-native Lespediza cheap at, you know, hundreds and bags of them. Immediately we can distribute them all over to the farmers to plant. You can't get that with native seeds in the old days. Now, some of that's changed quite a bit since then. So it's the fact that they could get them in big amounts and distribute them, you know, make some money off it too. But DNRs did a lot of that. The state of Illinois did that for years. And I think it was, I forget what the year it was. We actually went away from exotics almost, well, we did it completely in our nursery. We plant all native. And the issue, well, I can tell you, Iroquois County was a good story. My guys, I used to work for DNR, like Mike. My guys on one side of Iroquois killing autumn olive, and the other side the wildlife guys are planting it. Well, that's not, you know, that's not good government. So what we decided is, well, why aren't we just planting natives? It makes a lot of sense. Everything evolved together. It's what could be wrong with it? The nurseryman over here at the time, actually he was from Indiana, Stuart Peckino. I don't know if any of you guys knew him, but he ran the Indiana nursery for years. He took the job in Illinois, and the debate was raging, you know, as you can imagine. And then finally, the head of the forestry department said, all right, Stuart, what's the deal? Can you grow these things? And Stuart, it was a classic remark. He goes, I'm a nurseryman. You get me the seeds, I'll make them grow. Remember, Stu? So anyway, that was sort of he threw down the gauntlet. So the question was, can you get the seed? And I was like, well, you can't get the seed. Well, we got the seed. He just went out and, you know, picked them. You know, how hard can it be to get gray dogwood seed? So we did that. We gave him the seed. He started planting them. They all grew like crazy. We went from growing like 1 million autumn olive and 2 million bush honeysuckle, essentially the whole nursery, to now there's like 60-some different species of native plants, just, you know, prairie plants growing there, plus all the native trees. So it's phenomenal change, you know, that happened in the DNR.
Olive's bad.
Pardon me?
Autumn olive is not good.
It's really bad. And what happens with the catch with the non-natives are, you know, here's how they're sold. Insect-free, disease-free, easy to grow. Well, the reason that is because they have no natural enemies over here, so they come, and it wouldn't be so bad if they were just here and there, because you can get rid of them over time. But when you disperse them all over the state in 2 or 3 years, I mean, all it takes for them to, take off. Some species takes 30, 40 years. Bradford pear, I don't know if you're familiar with that, you may have them in your yard. That was the token plant that said they're sterile and they're good. 30 years, took 30 years, and now that thing's a weed. And you all saw the movie Jurassic Park? Do you remember when they're at dinner and Jeff Bloomberg's in there with his black suit on, and they're all talking about, this is great, they've got the fence, they're all neuterized or whatever they're right, and he goes, I'm telling you, they'll find a way to reproduce. Remember that line? Yeah. Well, that's exactly how this is. I don't care what you say. The grass carp, same way. The story there was, well, these are all sterile. And you read the research on it, and 1% of them might not be. 1%. That's good enough for government? No, it's not. If you take 1% of 10, no problem. It's probably going to die out. But when you distribute literally thousands, well, that 1% is hundreds. So sure enough, grass carp, they're reproducing right now. So yeah, it's a long story. It's something that's been, well, it's considered now to be the second most problem for endangerment of species and habitats, next to just actually losing the habitat completely, is exotic species. Because it's nefarious, it changes everything. Crowds things out, hybridizes. And it's not just here, the other countries do the same thing. I'll give you an example. In England, they actually introduced our cordgrass, which is a Spartina. And they have a cordgrass over there, it's maritime, it's Spartina maritimus. They brought ours over, which is an upland species, but it gets down close to it. They hybridized, and it's just like an aggressive grass now. It just takes over all their wetlands. So, it's not just here, it goes the other way. Goldenrod, it's common over here. We got like 14 species. It doesn't occur in England. It was like the garden plant to have, sort of like purple loosestrife over here. They planted that, now it's in every field over there, and they're cursing us. So, keep the native stuff.
Sorry.
Oh, that's good.
A couple of hardcore traditionalists that don't like pheasants, they say that's one of the reasons the prairie chicken's gone. I think after the TNC told me that.
Well, that's partly true. I mean, that would be putting a lot on the pheasant because the prairie chickens were pretty much doomed before the pheasant got here. But what the pheasant does now in Illinois, where we have prairie chickens, is you all know how the cowbird works. It's a parasitic bird on nests, so it lays its eggs. Turns out pheasants do that to prairie chickens. They'll actually find a nest and they'll go, well, this is cool. And the hen just lays her egg in there, but here's the bad side. The pheasant eggs hatch like 3 days before the prairie chicken eggs. So when those chicks hatch, the prairie chicken takes off with the pheasant chicks. So guess what we did? And it took a lot of political messing around. Were you around for that, Mike? When they shot all the pheasants at the prairie chicken, we call it the prairie chicken ranch, the prairie chicken sanctuary. We shot all the pheasants there. We just went out and shot them. They shoot them all year round. If they see a bunch of them run across the road, little chicks, get rid of them. It was a big political issue, but we had this last remnant of the prairie chicken, and that was one of the things we knew was a problem. And then on top of that, it's isolated population. We talked a little bit about genetics. We wound up having to do reintroduction from Minnesota. We traded otters for prairie chickens to see if we can get, that's the closest genetic population we could find. And so it's still, not doing really good, but they're still hanging on. And then I'm going to anticipate the next question. What about reintroduction of prairie chickens? Well, no one has done, I keep asking, I keep looking. No one's actually been successful with that, and the reason is, they got a real complicated sex life. I mean, it's unbelievable. You do that dance, you know about the dance? Prairie chicken dance? And so they're out there doing all that, and they got to have leks. And it turns out that the birds that have been at the chicken sanctuary in Illinois, they'll actually go to these bean fields and dance. And it's a historic lek. It's like they know. I mean, that's where they used to dance, and what it turns out to be, obviously, is that it's a good place. It looks like the perfect place to dance. So they go there, and they're out in the open, and then you have a marsh hawk come by and buzz them. You got endangered species eating endangered species. It's a cruel world out there.
How about coyotes?
We love coyotes. What about them? They've essentially reintroduced themselves, all over the east from the west. And the story I'll tell you about the coyotes is they have a negative effect on foxes. That'll be the next question somebody wants to know, and it's true. And the reason is, red fox in particular is circumpolar distribution, so it's everywhere. But it never really made it all the way down like through the East Coast. There's not a lot of red fox bones and stuff found in middens in the East Coast. But you see a dramatic increase in red fox right after the British showed up. Why is that? Because they were hunting foxes, red foxes in England, And they came over here and they go, well, let's just chase this gray thing around. And we had gray foxes out here in the woods. Still, we have them here too. So they start to chase the gray fox. They'd be all suited up, and there's going to be a big day of them riding horses and chasing foxes. And about 20 minutes into it, dogs are standing around looking at each other, and the gray foxes up the tree. They have semi-retractable claws, so they can climb up trees. So when they get tired of the dogs chasing them, they just climb a tree, jump over a log, and the scent's gone. The dogs are standing looking at each other, and the guys right up and go, hey, I didn't even work up a sweat yet. So they brought foxes over. And then, they've just spread like you'd expect. Now, the reason the gray fox and the coyotes can get along is not so much the coyote, but the red wolf. The red wolf was the wolf in the east. And red wolves are bigger than coyotes. Small can't stand up to large can't stand up to mini can't step up to the organized. So red wolf would kill coyotes, just like wolves kill coyotes in the west. So the only way the gray fox could survive is it could climb. Red fox shows up, there's no more red wolves. There's no coyotes. So it spreads. It's got no problem. The coyotes are coming back, guess what? The old age thing is going to happen again. The red fox are pretty much in trouble. Because even if they're denned up, the coyote can take over their den and they'll kill the young. They can't affect the gray fox because they can't catch them, they can't find them. So, and that's called, one more thing on that so you get you've seen the stories about the wolves in Yellowstone, how they're essentially changing the environment just by being there. So that's a cascading effect, they call it. It's also called a depressing effect. So even though the wolves may not be eating something, it's making them change their daily habits. An example here in the Midwest is a guy did a study on coyotes at a military base, radio collar, and this coyote, or raccoon, the first year, he was just everywhere. And he'd actually sleep out in the middle of a bean field. He'd just be out there, like, you can see him there, just laying up there sleeping. Well, the next year, he had a hard time finding him, number one. He went to all the usual places, couldn't find him. And when he did find him, it turns out the raccoon wouldn't ever leave the edge of the forest. He'd always stay inside. He wouldn't go outside. And for those of you that study and interested in birds, a lot of them nest on the edge, and predators actually patrol down the edges so they can find them. Well, this guy would never go on the outside all of a sudden. Guy couldn't figure it out. So he finally decided something was going on he couldn't figure. So he went out and he started looking through the whole area that he had been before. And guess what he found? Coyote den. So the raccoon knew the coyote was there, and he was not going to go out across an open field with a coyote anywhere near because he didn't know where he was the next minute. He could be halfway out there, the coyote shows up, and he's the next meal. So that's called the depressing effect. So as long as the coyote's there, even if he's not killing raccoons, even if he's not killing foxes, the fact that he's there is going to change their daily habits. And that's important. That's more than, even if you killed them, that's even a better deal, keeping them inside. So you had a question.
What's happened to the gray fox? The last 30 years, they've basically gone completely.
How do you know that?
I'm a trapper.
You haven't caught a gray fox in 30 years?
Not about 15 years ago was the last one I caught, and I've caught over 1,500 coyotes.
Really?
Mm-hmm. They're that gone.
It's coyote larceny, he leaves the
Well,
state every year.
That could be wrong. But where I live in Illinois, we have lots of coyotes, and we still see gray foxes. And I don't trap them, but...
Zero.
Huh?
Even I just come back from Arkansas trapping down there in the Delta there. I picked one off the road there, and the conservation officer was tagging all our bobcats. And
Yeah.
stuff. And he goes, wow, he says, I haven't seen one of those in years.
Well, that sounds like more than coyotes then.
Oh, it's definitely more than coyotes.
Yeah. Huh.
As a kid, I remember trapping a couple that were mixed, like half gray and half red.
Those are grays.
It is gray?
Yeah.
They got red down their side.
Yeah, they're even different genus, so they don't hybridize. Yeah. That comes up a lot with the squirrels too, but they don't.
Oh, I see that. I live on a river to half fox, half gray.
But they don't. They don't crossbreed.
It's real big. It's real big, but it's gray.
Yeah, but it's really a fox squirrel, most likely. They can't even get them to breed in captivity that way, even though they're the same genus. The fox squirrel and the red squirrel are the same genus, but they don't hybridize. No one's found a hybridization one that's been verified by DNA. And the red squirrel is a completely different genus. It's closer to the chipmunk than it is to the squirrel, tree squirrel.
You know, you said about the bigger, is more powerful or whatever.
Well, it's,
In the squirrel world, the fox is probably the most docile.
Yeah.
Then the gray and that little piney's meaner than any of them.
yeah, well, it pays to be mean when you're little. Trust me, I know. Think of weasels. But if that fox squirrel ever turned on him, he'd be toast. Anything else? It could be, I was thinking back to the fox. See, no matter what it was, though, I think it would affect them all, distemper, parvo, whatever it might be.
Coons come down with feline distemper,
Yeah,
and which we've got a problem seems to be occurring through here. And I did talk to a biologist one time, I was doing a research in Mississippi on coons.
Yeah,
And at that time, feline just never went through there, and the gray fox population just about disappeared.
really. That's more likely the answer, though, I bet.
That's kind of what I was.
Because it sounds too widespread just to be.
Someplace in, you know, like in the mountains of the Ozarks and stuff there, they still have a good gray fox population, smaller coon population.
Well, yeah, you know, the raccoons have actually exploded. When settlement came, raccoons weren't all that common. When we settled it, it made perfect habitat for them. And speaking of that, there's some theories going on now that after the Civil War, and you can picture the South completely, you know, blown up if you want, that there's evidence in diaries and stuff that suggests that the quail population was like okay, but after the Civil War, it exploded because you know essentially created by default these perfect habitats for it because a lot of the fields were abandoned. You know, 2 or 3 years later, it's full of legumes and full of broom sedge. And it was just perfect, and so it just exploded. And a lot of land was just forgot, left, and then the plantations built up again.
Doing research for the documentary, I would come across the phrase, it would mention a silver fox, where they were talking about a gray, the silver fox. And Beaver Lake was full of them.
They might have been calling that, but that's a color phase of the red.
Yeah, but that's usually north. If I was guessing if they were saying in the Kankakee silver, I'd say gray.
Calling it a gray.
Yeah.
Yeah, I also would see log cock. And I finally figured out they were talking about a pileated woodpecker.
Oh, yeah, that could be.
Called log cock.
Yeah, sure.
What the hell are they talking
Yeah.
about?
Well, then, prairie wolves were coyotes. And,
Yeah.
Right.
yeah, there's a whole list of those names that, people have sort of figured out what they are. And some of them are pretty remarkable.
Yeah. Good job, Fran.
Thanks.
I want to thank you.